Bhadramati, for a very, very generous introduction. Thank you. So, I know it's a bit late, but Happy New Year to all of you. Happy New Year. I hope this is a really good year for all of us, well, not just at the LBC, but all of us everywhere. It's going to be a big week, isn't it? In a few days' time, we'll have a new President of the United States of America, Friday, I believe. And I think that's a momentous, huge event for the world. Whatever your politics, it will have an effect on us. And then I guess in a few months' time, we'll be triggering leaving the European Union. So there's going to be huge changes probably for us in this country, and probably ripples throughout the European Union. I feel that there's the world. I mean, I'm not a politician. I'm not even that up on current affairs. But even in my relative ignorance, it does feel like there's sort of seismic shifts happening in the sort of fabric of our society, and not just in this country. Increasingly, you get some right-wing governments in Europe, the rise of nationalism. Our secular democracy feels quite fragile, and even where we're abiding by that secular democracy, the sort of consequences of that democratic process, certainly to me, don't feel very mature or positive in many ways. And then, we only have to think about the destruction of the environment and the destruction of so many species around us every day to feel that all is not right. All is not right. Now, I don't want to be completely doom-laden, because I feel that there's lots of positive things happening in the world. Lots and lots of positive things happening. But I think maybe they don't make the headlines, they don't make the news, the everyday acts of kindness and generosity that so many people in the world contribute to. But nevertheless, I think that given where we are in 2017, in this very privileged country, I think it's fair enough to pause and start to just question what we're doing with our lives as individuals. What are we doing? How are we acting? And are we contributing to the world being a better place or not? Because I think that if we don't ask ourselves, if we go just with the flow, if we stay with the status quo, the flow doesn't seem to be going in a very good direction. That's what I'm trying to say. I think it is beholden on each of us to see if we can be making a positive contribution to the world around us. And how best do we do that? So yes, I sometimes pause to reflect on whether what I'm doing is making a positive difference, and enough of a positive difference. Is this what I should be doing? And this weekend I was sort of reflecting, particularly, well, on Saturday, it was Saturday just gone, it was a day of reflection for me, because it was my 18th order birthday. So I was publicly ordained in 1999 on the 14th of January. So that was 18 years ago. And I was publicly ordained by Subhuti, my public preceptor, my teacher, in India, in a retreat centre near Nagpur called Bodharan. And I vividly remember the occasion. It was a public holiday in India, not because I was being ordained. I think I was being ordained that day because it was a public holiday. Still, one wonders sometimes. And Borderan is a sort of tourist place. I mean, it's a Buddhist retreat centre, but in India, the Dharma is, even if you don't think of yourself as a Buddhist, the Dharma is part of the culture in India still. The Buddha is sort of, the figure of the Buddha is part of the Indian psyche. And so people come from all over just to have a look at a Buddha Rupa. And Borderan, the shrine room, is a huge circular shrine room in the shape of a stupa. So you're inside the stupa. And I think between 5,000 and 10,000 people turned up to my ordination. None of them did I know, apart from my mother, who flew out. Anyway, it was a big day for me and my 5 order brothers who were ordained alongside me by Subhuti. But the 14th of January was on Saturday was also the 40th anniversary of my father's death. So 4 decades ago, I was 11 and he died. And so that was also a very big sort of seismic shift in my own life, a turning point in my own life, which obviously has its elements of pain, but it also brought with it meaning and led pretty much, I'm sure, in a very potent and direct way to me becoming a Buddhist. It was also my nephew's 32nd birthday on Saturday. So Saturday is this day, 14th of January is a day where I reflect on my family, my kinship, my birth, my parents, and on my order family, my Sangha, my teacher, my teachers, and the fact that 18 years ago I made a commitment which I didn't realise what that commitment would mean. It really was a step into the unknown. And 18 years later, in a way, I'm still on some sort of adventure which is unfolding in at times what feels like a magical way. When my father was dying, on his deathbed, he was in a lot of pain. He was having a heart attack so he died of a heart attack. But it was a long, drawn out, it took several hours. And he called me to his side. I was confused, scared. Anyway, he called me to his side and he held my hand, and I can remember him holding my hand. And he was half talking to me and half just talking, I guess. He was in a lot of pain, agonizing pain. And one of the things he was saying, he was trying to confess that he had he'd been harsh in his life. He was prone to anger and harshness, and that he'd caused a lot of pain. He'd made people's lives difficult, and he wanted to confess that. So I'd never heard my father confess anything. It was, I could sort of hear it. I didn't know what to make of it. I think I was just in shock. But those words have stayed with me. And I think they had an influence on me because somewhere along the way I wanted answers to, well, what was life about then? I didn't want to live the life that my father had lived and die feeling that I had made life difficult for people, that I'd been harsh in my life. I didn't want that, and I knew that went in very deeply. I did want a life that was meaningful, and I didn't know whether my father had had a meaningful life, but I couldn't quite see the meaning in it. He'd had a difficult life. He'd struggled all his life. He was born. Well, I won't go into my father's life, but it was very, very difficult. But I didn't know if it had meaning. Life can be difficult, but can have meaning, and I didn't know if it did. And I can remember feeling that I couldn't understand how adults around me went around their normal everyday activities in the face of death. Something wasn't right. And then as I grew older and developed more of a social conscience, I became politically active as a student. And I wanted to help change the world. And I think somewhere along the way, I felt that there needed to be an answer to the question of death. There needed to be a meaningful answer to our mortality. And there needed to be a life that contributed to, made a positive difference to the world. I was a student in the era of Margaret Thatcher. And, it was a time of quite a lot of social upheaval and turmoil. The miners were striking, communities were being broken. And I guess there was a lot of anger and fear. Probably I contributed to some of the more negative things, as well as trying to be politically active in a positive way. So I say all this because, where I stand now, it's not like I have answers. I don't think Buddhism provides you with answers. But what it does say is that in the face of mortality and in the face of dukkha, in the face of a world that is shot through with suffering and always will be, it does say, look, there you can find meaning, you can have a meaningful life. And I tried to practice Buddhism as a 19-year-old because I had a sense that Buddhism was part of the answer. The Dharma was true. What I lacked as a 19-year-old was Sangha. I had no sense of others who are also really practicing. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what Sangha meant. I didn't know what friendship in the Sangha meant, what Kalyana Mitrata meant. I had no real sense of comradeship, community, and the love and support that comes from that. So it's Sangha that I wanted to focus on. And last year, when I gave this, Mandala evening talk, launching our year last year, I started talking about the Four Sangharavastus. They're a teaching from the Buddha about four aspects or four ways in which the Sangha stays unified, stays harmonious, stays alive, stays vibrant. The Sangharavastus come from the compassionate activity of a bodhisattva. So they're very, very advanced practices, at least as Sangharavastus. They're a bodhisattva, an enlightened being, acting compassionately in the world. And what a bodhisattva does, out of compassion, is to create Sangha. And the Sangharavastus are how he or she does that. So the first Sangharavastu, which I talked about last year, is dana, or generosity. And I talked about dana at all sorts of levels. I'm not going to be able to recapitulate on that, but I believe it's still available online. But the second Sangharavastu, which I'm going to touch on today, or try to touch on, is called Priyavadita. Priyavadita. Priyavadita is, Priya is a word for love. It's also in modern Indian languages, it's a word for the beloved. So you call your beloved Priya, a very, very affectionate, sweet, emotionally beautiful word. And Vadita is a word for speech. So it's loving speech. Sometimes it's called kindly speech, but I prefer to think of it as words of love. And Priyavadita is what I'll talk about mainly. But I just want to say a little bit more about Sangha in this divided world and why I think it's so important. Why the Sangharavastus are so important. I guess that we're seeing some forces in the world which are at war with each other. And one of those forces seems to be a sort of secularism, even a strident, even a sort of militant secularism. At its best, it gives freedom to practice Buddhism and other religions. At its best, it gives you democracy with the freedom to express yourself as an individual. But even a benign democracy like ours seems to leave a value vacuum, a vacuum that doesn't tell you, democracy can't tell you what life is for. It can't answer the question of mortality. It can't give you meaning. It says nothing about where meaning is to be found. And then in that vacuum that opens up, if we're not careful, what fills that vacuum is greed and consumerism, and a belief that happiness can be found through just becoming wealthier. Now that may sound not too bad, although it leads to untold damage and destruction wider in the world. It's also a very superficial response to the question of what life is about, and therefore it can't really meet our heart's desires. But I guess worse things can also, or more virulent things can also fill this vacuum. On the sort of, as a reaction to this, what you can have is militant religious fanaticism. You can have fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism, that also tries to fill this vacuum and answer the question of what's meaningful in life. And you can see this going on in our world, and the opposition between them can't lead to a transcendent solution. It's not going to work. Sangha, I think, has a different ideal in place. A lot of utopian ideals, like, I don't know, Marxist communism, would have said that yes, you can create this utopian world, this utopian society, by working together. But as far as, and I'm not an expert in any of this, but as far as I could see, Marxism as it was lived out anyway had no place for individual flourishing, for the individual living to their potential, and that can't have been the answer. Well, it was proven not to be. Sangha is an ideal of fellowship, of community. Community is too small a word for it, where individuals flourish to their full potential. And the flourishing isn't in a superficial way of just becoming wealthier. In fact, Sangha members tend not to become wealthier. If they have money, they tend to give it away to help the Sangha flourish. It gives you a much, much more noble ideal of transcendence at an individual level, and then fellowship, comradeship, community at a collective level, not just for its own sake, but so that we can be a force for good in the world. But the reason that the word community isn't adequate for Sangha is that Sangha doesn't exist without the Dharma. Communities can exist without the Dharma. Communities can exist in all sorts of contexts, secular or otherwise. The Dharma is a path of leading to a transcendent vision, exemplified, embodied by the Buddha. And without a transcendent ideal, Sangha doesn't exist. So Sangha is a fellowship of all of us, of people who are committed to a transcendent ideal. And it's interesting that the Dharma without the Sangha isn't enough. I think this needs perhaps more exploration than I'm going to have time for. In our individualistic age, increasingly people want the Dharma without the Sangha. There's more and more call for... Actually, people seem to want the Dharma without the Buddha as well. That's the rise of something called secular Buddhism. Actually, I think that's the Dharma without the Dharma, but they don't know that. So I don't know what they think they're getting. But increasingly, people seem to want the Dharma without the Sangha, so that you can practice meditation in your room, you can be ethical and kind in your sphere of influence, but you're not necessarily embedded in a network of relationships that are striving towards being a force for good in the world. So even this notion of self-transcendence, people are starting to think that it can happen, as it were, on their own. That I can see through the delusion of a fixed and separate self, as it were, on my own. But if it's a genuine seeing through, then it should be a seeing through of the distinction between self and other, between me and you. And if that's a genuine seeing, then surely what happens is Sangha. That's what should be created. So I'm wary of Dharma without Sangha. I'm wary of Sangha being seen as some sort of optional extra for people who are, extrovert or like that sort of thing. Sangha is part of the triple gem, it's part of the three jewels, and it's an intrinsic part. Because I think even genuine insight into the nature of reality or into the nature of the lack of fixed and separate selfhood, even that can be appropriated to our egotism. Our egotism goes very, very deep, and Sangha seems to me an essential means of overcoming selfishness, of overcoming So that's why I want to talk about the Sangharavastus. That's why I want to talk about Priyavadita, about loving speech, about words of love. I hope you can hear me out there. Maybe you can say yes if you can hear me. Yeah. Really? That's good, isn't it? And if you're listening online, I'm told that I'm being live streamed online. So if you're listening online, welcome, and I hope you can hear me too. So, Priyavadita, Bhante talks about it as speech that is truthful. He says that it's truth spoken with love. Truth spoken with love. Because loving speech, kindly speech, can be, it could be, couldn't it? It could just be not very truthful. I guess if it's not very truthful, it could be sentimental, perhaps even hypocritical and manipulative, like one of those greeting cards, that you can buy that says all the right things, and means none of them, and you just sign your name at the bottom. I think this is an important point to make, because I think superficiality is another danger, current that's very, very prevalent in our age. Not helped, I'm afraid to say, by technology. I think, I know it's not always the case, because without technology, I don't know, the London Buddhist Centre now wouldn't function, or it wouldn't have so many people coming along. But you look at social media, and I occasionally do, and you might get words of love, you might get words of truth, but generally, Facebook doesn't lend itself to the most profound, meaningful discourse, generally. I'm generalizing, because I think actually in the Sangha it can be a very useful tool for staying in touch with each other. But I also feel that it's somehow social media is educating us in superficiality. It's educating us in keeping our attention rather fragmented and on the surface, and distracted and rather superficial. Liking a text doesn't quite, a post doesn't quite, mean something. In the Sangha, sometimes people do post things that are very meaningful, things that are happening in their life. And Facebook, I know you can comment, but sometimes you just get lots of likes. Somebody might be ill, and you get lots of likes. And what are you saying? What is one saying? It's all right for posting. I posted myself actually last autumn. I don't post very often to Facebook. I posted some photographs I'd taken that I was rather proud of. And I got 64 likes. And I was very, very happy. I was also rather obsessed. I noticed how my attention, as I was trying to work at my desk, my attention kept going to, I'll just check again to see if anybody has done it. And of course, after 2 or 3 days, people stopped, didn't they? Last week I checked again, and it's still 64. So I didn't like what it did to me, this kind of notion of checking. Anyway, enough about social media. I just want to say that we've got to watch that our speech isn't so influenced by technology that we start to relate to each other, conditioned by the norms of Twitter. I find it particularly sad when the President of the United States-to-be seems to communicate to the world through his Twitter account. That does say something, doesn't it, about the state of what we consider leadership to be. Anyway, speaking the truth with love is how Bhante talks about Priyavadita. And I think love, well, what he says love means complete awareness of the other person as a person. I think that Priyavadita can really only be spoken to one person at a time. Because you have to be aware of the person as another person, not in the sort of role, or not as a cipher, but as a human being, as another subject like oneself. You speak with awareness of the person and their state of mind and their situation, and you speak the truth with love. So this sort of speech, I think, is essential to our humanity. I know that sometimes it's said that speech itself is part of human culture, and of course it is, but I think that not all speech contributes to our humanness. Priyavadita does. I think it's an essential part of learning to be human, to speak with love. Speech unites the head and the heart. The throat chakra, which is a symbol for where speech comes from, sits between the head, as it were, and the heart. And speech needs our reason and our emotion in a unified way. Words of love have to bring together awareness and kindness, reason and emotion, head and heart, vision and volition. So in that sense, that sense of a synthesis, learning to speak with love is an essential part of the path. It's an essential part of the Eightfold Path. In terms of our precepts, it's one of kindly speech is one of 4 speech precepts. Speech is given a lot of weight in Buddhism. Words are given a lot of weight. And if we're really going to learn to speak the truth with love, we're going to have to examine our views. We are going to have to look at what is the truth. In this world of post-truth, which is a horrible term that's been coined, and fake news, it's not even easy to know what the truth is. It was never really easy to know what the truth is, but I think it's getting worse and harder. And the heart, it's so easy to imagine that Buddhism is not about the heart. I was told that there's a recent, I think it's a GCSE course book coming out on Buddhism. Munisha, who's a member of our order, was asked to review it. Unfortunately, she did, and she was saying that it was full of wrong views about Buddhism before she looked at it. And one of the quotes from it was something like, "When someone they love dies, Buddhists don't grieve because they believe that everything is impermanent." So Buddhists don't grieve. And there's such a sense, if that was popular views about Buddhism, there's such a sense that Buddhism involves becoming wise, and wisdom is somehow cool. That wisdom is a huge, rational, super-rational perspective on the world. Whereas actually wisdom is the emotional counterpart of wisdom is love. Wisdom is the, as it were, the knowing aspect of love. If enlightenment is having the largest possible perspective on what is, then it unites the head and the heart and transcends both of those in a vision that is unutterable. So I want to look at Priyavadita in several ways. First of all, I want to look at it, before I look at it as a Sangharavastus, as a means of unifying the Sangha, I want to look at it just in ordinary human life. How words of love, loving speech, is so vital to just ordinary human communication, to relationships. I think we so easily forget that at the end of our lives, what will matter is our relationships with each other and the people that we've touched in our lives. That's what will matter. Nothing else will have as much weight, I think, as the expressions of love and the relationships of love between us. Very often, in ordinary secular kind of human life, our words of love are reserved for the beloved. And by the beloved, unfortunately, we don't mean in the Sufi sense of a transcendent ideal. The beloved is normally our romantic partner, our lover. And our words of love are usually reserved for that one special person who we will croon to, and hopefully they will croon back frequently. Frequently by text, probably. Ideally, at least once an hour, there ought to be an exchange of words of love on your mobile phone. I went to see La La Land at the weekend. I do recommend it. Everybody I've talked to loved La La Land, apart from one person who is sitting over there. But I won't name you, Ollie. Well, I mean, it's not a masterpiece, but it is very enjoyable. It is very, very enjoyable. And it celebrates, unashamedly celebrates this romantic myth, this romantic ideal, which, by the way, is another myth, another value that falls into this vacuum that I was talking about. Actually, that's often, in our society, what fills this vacuum of meaning. It's the romantic ideal, the romantic myth. That's what we believe will make us completely fulfilled. And La La Land is a very touching kind of celebration. Well, actually undercuts the romantic ideal as well. And it's a homage to the musicals, the beautiful, innocent musicals of the 50s and 60s of Hollywood. It's a sort of love song to Hollywood musicals. And at its own level, it sort of works, I thought. Anyway, I'm speaking, Ollie, so you can, when you're giving a talk, you can knock La La Land. But I think if we're seduced by the romantic myth, if we think that that's where words of love are solely kind of reserved for, then we're going to live a very impoverished life. We're going to live a very impoverished life. Really, they ought to be everywhere, these words of love, in all of our relationships. At my mother's 70th birthday, I felt very, very pleased to be able to publicly rejoice in her. And she didn't know I was going to do that. It was a sort of birthday gathering, and I was unabashedly able to talk about her qualities, one of which was, she radiated love. She was a very, very loving woman, and I was able to rejoice in her very fulsomely. And I'm very, very glad I did, because a few years later I rejoiced again, but it was at her funeral. And in between times, I hadn't had the opportunity to at least publicly rejoice in her. It was literally a few years later, 4 years later probably, that she died. And again, at the funeral, I was able to rejoice in her love. I like to think that she was listening. But if she was, at least, she wasn't physically present. I wasn't able to see her listening. Our parents are, if you can rejoice in them while they're alive, then I really, really urge you to. Now, I know that you may not have straightforward relationships with your parents, and maybe you're not in a place to rejoice in them. If that is the case, then I was going to say as a Dharma practitioner, but I just mean as just as somebody who's lived 50 years and both my parents are gone. I'd really urge you to, if you can't rejoice, to at least try and forgive. To forgive your parents while you can, while they're still alive, if that's what is needed. And I guess forgiveness can't be magicked up. I know forgiveness is a very difficult thing for some for some of us in some situations. If your parents have let you down very, very badly and you're not even able to yet forgive, well, work on that. But in the meantime, at least let's try not to blame. Let's try not to blame. But ideally, let's rejoice. Let's rejoice in the people that gave us life. When you rejoice, when we rejoice, one of the things that happens is that for a while we drop beneath the sort of roles that we sometimes adopt, the masks and the personas that we sometimes adopt. And we meet as human beings, speaking the truth with love. That's why I think that sometimes, I was talking about Facebook. One of the insidious things about social media can be that we adopt a persona. We have a Facebook persona. And if that's the case, then there's no real truth that can be communicated. But when you rejoice genuinely, for a while you drop the roles. I can remember, I've said this story before, but I remember a former boss of mine. Before I started working here, I was still working in the corporate world, and this he wasn't directly my boss. He was a sort of, I had, complicated kind of reporting lines. I was reporting to two people, or at least, and he was one of them. And he was, I didn't know him very well. I'd only been working for him for probably less than a year. I'll call him John. His name wasn't John, but just in case he's listening online. He was a bully in that classic corporate mould. I think he was a really unpleasant boss to have. I managed to somehow never quite get on the wrong side of him. I sort of managed to sort of get away from his wrath. And I never saw the worst of him directly, but I saw him treating others very, very badly. He would, just do manipulative, intimidating things like really, really bawl people out in public, make them cry in meetings. Call people, summon them to his office, telling them that he was angry, and then not turn up to meet with them. So they'd be left sort of fretting all day and then be at a meeting that he didn't turn up to, etc., etc. Really unpleasant kind of man. The day I resigned, I had to go and tell him that I was leaving. And I walked into his office, and it was a big day for me. I was frightened. And I walked into his office. It was a sort of glass office, big office, knocked on his door, and I said, I'd made an appointment to meet with him. And I can remember walking to his office, and I'd never noticed this before, but on a shelf was a Buddha figure. And it was the Buddha Ramoda Siddhi, making the gesture of fearlessness. And I just felt so sort of confident, having just seen that Buddha figure. It gave me so much faith and confidence. And I said to John, I have to tell you that I'm resigning. And he went purple. I mean, his face just went completely scarlet. He sputtered. He sort of sputtered out the words. He said something like he wanted to know who I was going to. I worked in helping set systems strategy, so he assumed that I was going to go to a competitor and reveal our systems strategic secrets, whatever they were. Not that it would have done much harm. Anyway, he assumed that I was going to go to a competitor, and he was furious, absolutely furious. And if there hadn't been a desk between us, I think he would have, it looked like he could have hit me. So I say to him, John, actually, I'm a Buddhist, and I'm going to work for the London Buddhist Centre to become their fundraiser. And there was this complete change. He sort of breathed out all this air, this fury just sort of left him. It melted from him. And what happened next was extraordinary. He started to rejoice in me. And he said, what we are doing here, meaning the work in the systems we were doing online, whatever we were doing. What we are doing here means nothing. You are going to do something really valuable with your life. And I applaud you for that. And if in any way I can ever help you, please don't hesitate to ask. Which was such a... So he took the wind out of my sails in a way that I hadn't anticipated. But what I'm struck by is in that moment, all roles fell away. I wasn't this employee. I wasn't betraying who he wasn't this big bad boss. He didn't have to be the bully. Do you see what I mean? All those roles, all the persona fell away. There was just another human being relating to me as a human being. I wasn't a threat. And also, he could relate on the basis of a higher value. He wasn't a Buddhist, but he'd been based in Asia for some years, so he might have had some knowledge of it. And we related on a very different basis. Anyway, that's what I want to talk about in just rejoicing, priyavadita, in ordinary human relationships. It's so, so valuable. I look back on that meeting with John with real warmth. It was a gift he gave me. But human kindness isn't enough, I'm afraid. It really, really, wonderful though it is, it isn't enough. Without a transcendent ideal, human kindness would be humanism, and yes, the world would be better if we had more of it, but frankly it doesn't answer the question of mortality, of death, of the suffering around us. It doesn't do that adequately. It's not Sangha. So it's as a Sangharavastus that I think I want to really talk about priyavadita most. And in the Sangha, our Sangha is characterized, I hope, by our rejoicings in each other. I think we're pretty good at it. I think we could be better. Of course we could be better. But I think one of the gifts that Bhante has given us is create a Sangha where he's taught us to celebrate each other, to encourage each other, to rejoice in each other. He's put a very, very strong emphasis on kalyana mitrata, on spiritual friendship, on the need for love in our lives. Love not just for that one special beloved, but love for our brothers and sisters who are practicing, moving towards this transcendent ideal. And we need Sangha, we need that encouragement from our friends, our Dharma friends, not just because the ideal is hard, although it is, but we need to be rejoicing in each other because friendship and love and rejoicing are a wonderful way of, for a moment, stepping outside the prison of me, freeing ourselves just for a while from our self-centered, obsessive self-centeredness, where I want to be the center of everything, all the time. Rejoicing in somebody else is at least a way of reaching out into, if it's genuine, into the world of another in the most positive way. And it creates an atmosphere that is beautiful for everybody. Some of you have just been on retreat. Many of you have been probably on one of our winter retreats. And some of you were fortunate enough to be on the teams for our winter retreats. And one of the beautiful things about being on a team for a winter retreat is this exemplification of Sangha and this exemplification of rejoicing. I'm fortunate enough to live in a community. I've lived in a community here at the Buddhist Center for 20 years. And every time somebody comes back from a retreat, they come back to cards and flowers and chocolates. And I live in a men's community, and men don't tend to, out there in the world, leave cards and chocolates and flowers for each other. But every time somebody comes back from a retreat, I come back to cards and flowers and chocolates and rejoicing. People tell me that they've missed me. It's just wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. Sometimes it can, I live with 8 others, and you have to keep track of who's away and who's coming back when. And that is a practice. Sometimes I don't get it right. Maitreya Bandhu, when he last came back from a retreat, just this winter retreat, I had a card in my hand, which I was just about to leave in his room, but he got back before I could. And it was rather sort of unceremoniously handing him a chocolate while trying to give him a hug and tell him that I'd missed him while being late for somebody else. So sometimes, I don't get it right. But nevertheless, even in the trying to rejoice, there's something very, very positive. But Priyavadita doesn't just manifest in our rejoicings, in our encouragement of each other. Words of apology, of forgiveness, can also be words of love. Words of apology and of forgiveness can also be words of love. And the Sangha needs to be characterized by confession and apology and forgiveness, because none of us is perfect. None of us is perfect. And we should be freely able to confess our shortcomings and apologize for them. And then we should be forgiving each other for our shortcomings, for not being perfect. It's such a burden if you expect the Sangha to be perfect. You'll make yourselves very unhappy if you think the Sangha needs to be perfect, or even if Bhante needs to be perfect. You'll make yourselves very unhappy, and you'll squander the most wonderful gifts of the Sangha simply by having silly expectations of perfection. Priyavadita can also include words that challenge us. In Kalyana Mitrata, sometimes we challenge each other in a way that is helping us to grow. At least challenge at its best can help us to grow, can help us to see our blind spots, can help us to sometimes painfully point out our shortcomings, have pointed out our shortcomings and our blind spots. If it's done with love, if it's done with metta, that can be one of the most wonderful gifts of friendship. Somebody who's willing to speak the truth that's difficult, if it's done with love, if it's done with sufficient love, is one of the most precious gifts of friendship. Of course, you have to be receptive to it. You have to be prepared to hear it, to be open to being challenged, which is a practice in its own right. Rilke said that praising is what matters, in one of his sonnets to Orpheus. Many of his sonnets to Orpheus are full of praise, and praising is what matters. But praising can include challenge, it can include forgiveness, it can include apology. I'm struck by the story of the Buddha at his parinibbana. So he's about to leave his human form, and Ananda is distressed, and the Buddha rejoices in Ananda. one of the last things that the Buddha says is his rejoicing in Ananda. He calls Ananda, who's weeping some distance away, and he calls for him, and he brings Ananda into the assembly, and he says to Ananda, "Why are you weeping?" And Ananda says that because my master is going away, because the eye of the world is about to leave, to go out. And the Buddha first of all says, "But Ananda, have I not been teaching you the Dharma? Have I not been teaching you the Dharma? All these years, for 45 years, I've been teaching the Dharma." And then he just rejoices, and he talks about how Ananda is full of love, and how people love Ananda because he is full of love, and how Ananda has served the Buddha so faithfully for so long. And it's like love speaking of love in love. It's just this celebration of friendship, this celebration of discipleship, this celebration of humanity at its best. It's the enlightened mind rejoicing in the unenlightened mind. That's quite something, isn't it? The enlightened mind rejoicing in somebody who's yet to be enlightened. Sometimes that rejoicing goes beyond words, and I'm going to say a little bit about how it can go beyond words. I'm reminded of my ordination retreat 18 years ago in India. I was on that retreat with some people, some of my Indian brothers, who didn't speak any English, and I didn't speak any Marathi or Hindi, or very little, we didn't have any words in common. And very often they'd ask to meet up with me, in whatever way they did. And it was at first a bit perplexing to meet up with somebody that you couldn't say anything to. But they were some of the most delightful meetings of that retreat. So you had grown men want to just hold my hand and sit with me and smile. And people who are complete strangers just want to celebrate the fact that I was going to be ordained. Just walk with me, bring me tea, laugh and smile. And there was a love that was communicated that was so much more immediate and tender and direct than so many of the words that we use would have been. So often the words just get in the way. So I'm going to start just summarising. So I've spoken of the world and its need for Sangha. I believe that's what the world needs, perhaps more than ever now. How I believe that the Dharma and the Sangha are not just a solution to the world at a social level, but they're an existential answer to the question of mortality, of our death. They're what gives meaning to the human situation. I've spoken of Priyavadita, loving speech, as one of the means of creating Sangha. And how Priyavadita, even if you don't want to create Sangha, seems to me an essential human quality, just to be able to relate through loving speech is such an important human quality. And then in the Sangha, it takes on another level. But yes, then I've started to talk about how Priyavadita, these words of love, seem to point beyond speech altogether. Last Thursday, I was fortunate enough to meet with Bhante. I was at Adhisthana on a meeting of chairs of all of our European centres. There were about 60 of us. And I'd been there all week. And I knew that Bhante was there, around. I didn't want to ask to meet with him because he's recently been very ill. He's recovering from pneumonia. So I sent him a card, just rejoicing in him, expressing my love. I said in the card that I wish I had the words to really express the gratitude that I feel. I don't have the words. But I tried to communicate something of my love and well-wishing to him in the card. And then on the last day that I was there, Suvajra, who is one of Bhante's carers, found me in the morning and said, Bhante wants to see you. And I was just completely delighted that he wanted to see me. And we met. I mean, I've had time with Bhante before, but we met, and he had something particular that he wanted to tell me about our meeting, the chairs meeting. We talked about that. We talked about other things to do with the chairs meeting. We talked about leadership in our Sangha, the need for leadership, how important leadership was. I rejoiced in him as being such an exemplary. Well, I talked about him leading still. He's 91. He's recovering from pneumonia. And I still feel that he's just giving so much to our Sangha. He rejoiced in the LBC and all the people that go on retreat. He was talking about the retreat at Adhisthana, how pleased he was that we were having retreats at Adhisthana. And I told him a bit about the retreat at Vajrasana and said that I wished that he could see Vajrasana, but how grateful I was that he had blessed Vajrasana with his gifts. And I just thanked him for that. He rejoiced in how the LBC Sangha was flourishing. Just lovely kind of exchange. We talked about various things, but actually none of that really conveys what I experienced. What I experienced was my mind, consciousness, becoming brighter, bigger. There was a whiteness to my experience. That's how I can describe it. It was like a white light in my experience, and it was full of love. And I couldn't tell whether it was my love for Bhante or his love for us. It was just, there was this love. I felt, just for a moment, as if I was doing my sadhana, my meditation, my visualization practice. And yet we were still just talking about this and that. And I knew that we were also communicating at that level. I just knew it. It was as if no words were adequate to that communion, that communication. Communion is perhaps too strong a word, because I don't imagine that I could really reach his mind, but he could reach mine, and there was a communication, and but it was all done in a very, very polite, exquisitely refined way. As I was leaving, I bowed down and I touched his feet. And as I was doing that, he was still rejoicing. He was rejoicing in my sister, who'd sent him some Indian sweets that she'd made. And he asked me to thank her. And I said, she's very devoted to you, Bhante. And he said, I know. And I said, I'm very devoted to you too. And I touched his feet. And he said, well, goodbye then, at least for the present. And that was it. That was it. It was very, very simple, very, very human at one level, and utterly sublime at another level. Which brings me on to this figure that we've got on the shrine. This figure is of Manjidosha. Manjidosha is a figure that I've meditated on for probably about 12 years. And he is, Manjughosha means he's the gentle-voiced one. He's the kindly-voiced one. He's also called Vagishvara, who is the Lord of speech. He's the Lord of communication. He communicates the Dharma, and he does that with love. When I meditate, he's also the Bodhisattva of wisdom. That's how he's normally talked about. He holds this flaming sword that cuts through delusion. He holds this book of wisdom to his heart, the perfection of wisdom to his heart. And I've been meditating on him for 20 years. And perhaps at times I've glimpsed something of his wisdom, but mostly what I've felt is love, his love. That's what wisdom feels like. If you feel the Dharma, the nature of things, it's love. It's as if love is part woven into the fabric of things. And Manjughosha speaks with love, and he uses his voice to break through our ignorance, our delusion. He speaks from kindness as if he was speaking to his only child, his only son, or his only daughter. But he speaks to all living beings as if they were his only child. He speaks with this exquisite tenderness, which is also said to be like a thundering cloud, like a lion's roar, which is said to be terrifying because it wakes you up. He will speak in a way that will wake you up from your sleep of ignorance, from your sleep of self-centeredness and greed and hatred. He speaks in a way that will sometimes whisper and sometimes roar. And as he speaks, it's said that all our fetters, all the things that bind us to this suffering world are broken through his speech. And all the ignorance is dispersed, the darkness of our minds is dispersed, as if clouds were parting and the sun was shining through. He emerges from the sun. He's known also as the sun of speech, the kind sun of speech that blazes forth into this temporal world. This temporal world, this world of space and time, is a world of pain, and his speech comes from beyond that world into this world. He came to me in a dream before I started meditating on him. He came to me, well, actually in two dreams, and in the first dream, I was in this blue sky, vast blue sky, surrounded by a golden, orange, radiant, sun-like sphere that was made up of thousands of Manjughosha figures, and I was in the centre of them. Around that was a white sphere of Vajrasattva. And in the second dream, as if I hadn't got the point, which I hadn't, in the second dream, he sent me a letter, which I was reading in the dream. Actually, the letter came from Subhuti, who was my preceptor. And in the letter, in the dream letter, Subhuti says to me that he would like me to from now on, meditate on Manjughosha. And he gives me another name. Subhuti gave me the name Jnanavaca 18 years ago. And in this letter, in this dream letter, from Manjughosha via Subhuti, he gives me another name. He says that I'm going to give you a secret name, which I guess now is no longer so secret. And he says that I want to also call you Manjunata, which means protected by Manjughosha. It's also an epitaph of Manjughosha, but it means protected by Manjughosha. And since that time, since that dream, since I've meditated on the Bodhisattva of wisdom, the gentle-voiced one, the Lord of speech, the Lord who wakes us up from our delusion, since that time he's become a symbol for, as it were, my life beyond my life. I like to feel and think that this life is dreamlike, is somehow shot through with delusion. It's not what's really going on, that beyond this spatial, temporal, physical form, there's another aspect to us all the time, that's present all the time, that consciousness is not really completely bounded in space and time and form, that there's an aspect of consciousness which is free of all of those things, which is always at one with how things are. There's no delusion there. There's no need for delusion. The delusion is, even that is part of the dream. Reality is always present. The sun of speech, Manjughosha, is always speaking, but in a way there are no need for words. There's no need for words anymore, because words and speech are a human way of overcoming our separation. They're a way of communicating between heart and heart, mind and mind. But if there's no separation in the way things are, if there's no real distinction between me and you and self and other, if form is a delusion, if time and space are somehow part of the fabric of that delusion, then words don't mean anything. They're not needed. And the Lord of speech is also the Lord of silence. And the silence is full of love. I'll leave it there. Thank you.